In today's audiobook, we explore the invisible cost of loving the wrong person, the heart of the invisible cost of loving the wrong person, published by Unchained Heart. In these pages, we go beyond the surface, inviting you to sit with what this theme truly means in your own life. There is something that happens to a woman who has loved someone who needed too much from her. Not all at once. It never happens all at once. It happens the way a sweater unravels, one thread pulled, then another. And then one morning you reach for the warmth of yourself and find that some essential part of the fabric is simply gone, not dramatically, not with a single devastating event that would at least give you something to point to and say there. That is where it happened. No, it happens in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small moments. 1,000 times you swallowed what you needed to say. 1,000 mornings you woke up already measuring the emotional temperature of the room before you had even opened your eyes fully, already calculating what version of yourself would be safest to bring into the day. Perhaps you have noticed that you cannot always remember who you were before. Not completely. There are traces, a laugh you used to have that came as high, opinions you held without apology, desires that needed no justification. But somewhere inside the long project of loving someone who was never quite satisfied, never quite stable, never quite safe, those traces became quieter and quieter until you had to strain to hear them at all. This audiobook is for you. It is not here to diagnose what happened or to name the person who did this to you with a clinical label. Though many who work closely with emotional healing would recognize the patterns we will explore here. It is here, instead, to do something that may feel unfamiliar and perhaps even a little uncomfortable, to sit with you in the honest truth of what loving the wrong person actually costs. Not the obvious things, not the things that are easy to see from the outside, but the invisible things, the things that have no name and therefore no funeral, the things you are still carrying without even knowing how heavy they have become. In Chapter 1, we will sit with the beginning, the subtle ways in which a relationship becomes a place where one person consistently gives and the other consistently takes, and how, in the early seasons, this imbalance can feel almost like devotion. In Chapter 2, we will explore what happens to identity when love asks us to become smaller, how the self does not disappear in a single moment, but is slowly, quietly rearranged. In Chapter 3, we will look at the particular exhaustion that comes from being needed in the wrong way, the difference between being loved and being used, and how a woman who is trained to be needed can struggle to feel the difference. In Chapter 4, we will visit the body, because the body always knows what the mind is still arguing about, and it has been keeping a record. In Chapter 5, we will begin to sit with what healing actually looks like when there are no dramatic epiphanies, only the quiet daily work of finding your way back. And in Chapter 6, we will rest for a moment in what life begins to feel like when the invisible cost is finally, gently acknowledged, when the weight you have been carrying is seen, named, and slowly set down. Before we begin, if this audiobook is reaching you at exactly the right moment, the way that certain things do when we are finally ready to hear them, I would love for you to follow the Unchained Heart channel. There's a whole library of audiobooks here, written and narrated from this same place of honesty and warmth, for women who are doing the quiet, private work of coming back to themselves. Find the follow button wherever you are listening and press it gently. This is a place worth returning to. Let us begin gently at the root of this. Chapter 1. The shape of a relationship that takes there is a moment. Early in almost every relationship that eventually costs too much, where the taking begins so gently that it registers not as loss, but as love. You remember it, perhaps, not as a warning. You had no reason to read it as one. You remember it as proof that you were needed, that you mattered, that your presence made a difference in someone's world. Maybe it was the way he called at midnight, undone by something, and how the sound of your voice was the only thing that settled him. Maybe it was the way he looked at you after a fight, not with remorse exactly, but with something that resembled need so closely that your body could not always tell the difference. Maybe it was simply that he was so much, so consuming, so vivid in his need for your attention and your care, that loving him felt like having a purpose, a real one. the kind that made ordinary life feel meaningful. Those who work closely with emotional healing notice a consistent pattern. People who grew up in homes where love was conditional or unpredictable often find something deeply familiar in the company of someone who needs a great deal from them. The chaos feels like home. The intensity of being needed feels like love. The constant, low-level vigilance required to navigate an emotionally volatile person feels, to someone who has been doing it since childhood, almost comfortable. Not pleasant, comfortable. In the way that a chronic ache becomes a background, you have simply learned to live inside. In the early days, the giving feels reciprocal even when it is not. There's a kind of economy of affection in these relationships, moments of warmth and connection that function almost like wages paid for the labor of emotional management. He is wonderful for 3 days, and then the air changes and you spend the next week trying to understand what you did, or what you failed to do, and then he is wonderful again. And somehow the wondering and the relief and the gratitude for the return of warmth become so intertwined that you stop being able to separate them. The cycle becomes the relationship. And because cycles can feel like movement, like rhythm, like something living and breathing, it takes a long time to see them clearly as what they actually are, a door that only opens from one side. The taking in these relationships is rarely obvious, and this is important to understand, not because it excuses anything, but because it explains why a woman who is not naive, not weak, not without intelligence, can spend years inside something that is slowly costing her more than she has to give. The taking is often disguised as need. It presents as vulnerability, as complexity, as the depth of his feeling for you. His jealousy is evidence of how much you mean to him. His anger is a sign of how much is at stake. His dependency on your emotional labor is proof that no one else could love him like you do. And there is something inside a woman who has been shaped by conditional love to hear all of this as confirmation of her worth, rather than as warning signs of her disappearance. It begins with something small, always, a preference overridden, a plan canceled, a feeling set aside because his feelings were louder. These are the first threads. By the time you notice that something is unraveling, the pattern is already old, already familiar, already woven into the ordinary architecture of your days together. You will reach later, for the moment it began, and find that you cannot locate it with any precision. It was never a single moment. It was an accumulation, a slow and invisible erosion that was, in the beginning, almost indistinguishable from love. This brings us gently to what that erosion does, not to the relationship, but to you. Chapter 2. The woman you were before, there is a particular kind of grief that has no funeral. No date on a calendar, no gathered witnesses, no formal acknowledgement that something has been lost. It is the grief of a self slowly surrendered, piece by piece, in the service of a love that required you to be less, so that another person could be more. It is quiet. It is private. And for a long time, it does not feel like grief at all. It feels like compromise, like maturity, like the ordinary work of being in a relationship with a complex person. You used to have opinions, loud ones, sometimes not aggressive, but present. You knew what kind of food you wanted, what films moved you, what you thought about things. You can perhaps recall the feeling of that, of having preferences that lived easily on the surface of you, that did not require justification before they were allowed to exist. Somewhere in the years of loving someone whose needs were always larger, whose feelings were always more urgent, whose perspective on every situation quietly positioned itself as the correct one, your opinions moved deeper inside. Not because they were taken from you. Nothing so direct ever happened. But because expressing them had started to cost something. A shift in his mood, a silence that lasted too long, a look that asked without asking, "Why are you making this about you?" And so you learned, gradually, almost unconsciously, in the way that all the most important learning happens, to wait, to observe before speaking, to measure your words against his comfort before releasing them. You learned to laugh differently, a little more carefully, to dress in ways that did not provoke commentary, to spend less time with the friends who made him uneasy, not because he demanded it, but because managing his unease took more energy than the friendships were worth. You learned to be smaller, and you were so good at it. The terrible irony is that you were so good at it. Common patterns suggest that identity erosion in these relationships happens not through force, but through repetition. Through the 1,000 tiny corrections, the accumulated feedback of someone else's discomfort with who you are, until the woman you were before begins to feel like a different person, someone you remember distantly, with a kind of wistfulness, the way you might remember a younger self whose confidence you admired but could no longer quite access. There is a woman, and perhaps you recognize her, who, somewhere in her mid-30s, looked in the mirror one morning and found herself unable to answer a very simple question that her own reflection seemed to be asking. Not who are you? She knew the external answers to that, but what do you want? What do you think? What would you choose if the answer did not need to be calibrated first against how he would receive it? The silence that came in response to those questions was not peaceful. It was the silence of absence, of a self that had been present once and had, over the years, become almost entirely interior, buried so deep beneath the habit of prioritizing another person's emotional world that reaching it required real effort. This is not weakness. It is crucial to say that clearly and without softening it. This is not weakness. It is what happens to a woman whose capacity for empathy and attunement, qualities that, in the right environment, make her a remarkable partner, friend, mother. Human are exploited by a relationship dynamic that treats her emotional intelligence as a resource to be consumed rather than a gift to be cherished. She does not become smaller because she is less than. She becomes smaller because she is, in a very particular and painful way, more responsive, more attentive, more willing to do the emotional labor, and in this relationship, that abundance has been systematically redirected away from herself. Let us now sit with what it actually feels like to live inside that redirection. Chapter 3. The exhaustion that has no name. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix. You will have noticed this. The nights you finally got 8 hours and woke up already weighted. The holidays that were supposed to restore you and left you somehow emptier than before. The long weekends when his mood filled every room of the house and you spent 2 days managing the weather of him, so that by Sunday evening you were not rested, you were depleted in a way that had no language yet. No diagnosis, no word that fit it precisely enough to explain to anyone who asked why you looked so tired when you had not done anything particularly demanding. What you were doing, what you had been doing for years, is what many who work closely with this territory call emotional labor without reciprocity. The work of tending to another person's feelings, of anticipating their needs, of smoothing the emotional landscape before they could even notice it was rough. It is real work. It uses real energy. It requires real cognitive and emotional resources. The fact that it is invisible to him, and eventually to yourself, does not make it less costly. It makes it more so, because costs that are not acknowledged cannot be addressed. Think for a moment of the mental processes required on a single ordinary day inside a relationship like this. Waking and immediately reading the quality of his sleep from his breathing before you have even sat up. Moving through the kitchen carefully, choosing what to say about the morning in a register that is unlikely to disturb. Monitoring throughout the day, sometimes from a distance, through the texture of his texts, for signs of approaching weather, the constant internal calculation. Is this a good day or not? What version of myself is safe to bring forward right now? Should I mention the thing I need or wait until the moment is more settled? The answer is almost always wait. And waiting becomes the dominant mode. You become extraordinarily skilled at nachet. There is a woman who used to love mornings. She used to wake early and sit with her tea in the quiet and feel something that she can only describe now, looking back, as belonging to herself. She was good company for herself in those early hours. The mornings changed, not all at once. They became first a time of preparation, of mentally rehearsing how the day might unfold, of arranging herself inside it so that the sharp edges were covered. Eventually, they became a form of dread so normalized that she had forgotten they had ever felt like anything else. The loss of that particular pleasure, the private pleasure of her own early morning company, is one of the ones she mourns most, because it is one of the ones that was taken so quietly she never noticed it leave. Being needed in the wrong way is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can live through, precisely because need looks so much like love from the inside. He needs you. Is that not what love is? To be needed? But there is a quality of being needed that is sustaining and a quality that is extractive, and they are not always easy to tell apart until you have been emptied enough times to begin to notice that no amount of giving seems to fill the space. The need does not shrink in proportion to what you offer. It expands. It is not sated. It is organized around the expectation of being met. And the more completely you meet it, the more central and indispensable the role of meeting it becomes to the architecture of the relationship. Until the day you fail to meet it because you are human, because you have limits, because you have a self that occasionally needs attending to, and that failure becomes evidence of a deficit in your love. Those who spend time with this particular kind of relational exhaustion notice that the women who experience it often reach a point not of dramatic collapse, but of a kind of quiet blankness, a flatness. Not depression exactly, though it lives next door to it. More a dimming, a gradual reduction of the self to its functional minimum. The parts that are required to keep going while everything else, the curiosity, the desire, the aliveness that used to be so present, retreats to somewhere deep and quiet and out of reach. The body, however, is never quiet about this. Let us sit there for a moment now. Chapter 4. What the body has been keeping, the body does not lie, and it does not wait for permission to speak. While the mind is still arguing, maybe it is not that bad. Maybe I am being too sensitive. Maybe if I just tried harder, the body has already filed its report. It filed it in the tightening of the throat when he pulled into the driveway. It filed it in the shallow breathing that became habitual. The jaw that was always slightly clenched by evening. The stomach that never fully relaxed. It filed it in the skin that flinched at unexpected touch. In the headaches that had no medical cause. In the appetite that disappeared and reappeared in strange patterns. In the exhaustion that could not be explained by anything the body had actually done. Common patterns in those working through the aftermath of emotionally costly relationships suggest that the body often begins speaking years before the mind is ready to translate. The nervous system, in particular, develops what might be described as a kind of chronic readiness, a low-level state of preparedness for difficulty that never fully powers down, because within the relationship it had no safe opportunity to do so. The body learned that relaxation was a risk, that the quiet could end suddenly, that safety was always provisional, always subject to revision by something outside your control. You may have noticed, in the relationship or after it, that you startled easily, that loud voices made you shrink in a way that seemed disproportionate to the actual situation, that certain tones, a particular kind of silence, a specific quality of irritation in another person's voice, could shift your entire internal state in a moment, could move you from relative equilibrium to acute alertness without any dramatic event to justify it. This is not overreaction. This is a nervous system that has been trained by experience, a body that learned its lessons well. There is a woman who could not understand why she felt more anxious after she left than she had during, why the physical symptoms did not ease when the obvious source of them was gone. She had expected to feel better, lighter, freer. Instead, she felt untethered in a way that was frightening. Her body, which had organized itself around the task of managing danger, did not immediately know what to do without it. The vigilance had become her. Not a habit she could simply set aside, but a posture her nervous system had adopted so completely that she did not know how to stand any other way. This is one of the most important and least spoken truths about what prolonged emotional labor inside a difficult relationship does to a woman's body. It changes the baseline. Not permanently, this is crucial to hold, but meaningfully, in ways that do not resolve themselves simply because the relationship has ended. The body holds the record of what the mind lived through. It holds the patterns of protection, the learned reflexes of safety, the muscle memory of smallness, with a fidelity that can feel, in the early days of recovery, almost cruel. There is also what the body holds in terms of grief, physical grief, which is less often spoken of than emotional grief, but is no less real. The heaviness in the chest that arrives in waves, sometimes triggered by nothing more than a song, a smell, the particular angle of afternoon light. The way certain kinds of physical tiredness carry emotional weight inside them. The throat that closes around words that need to be spoken. The body grieving what the self is not yet ready to fully feel in the mind. All of this is information. All of this is the body doing what bodies do, carrying what cannot yet be carried anywhere else, holding the archive of everything that happened, waiting patiently for the day when you are ready to begin reading it. And that day does come, not as a dramatic turning point, more as a quiet, undeniable readiness. Let us sit now with what beginning looks like. Chapter 5. The beginning of finding your way back. No one tells you that coming back to yourself is not a single journey with a clear destination. They talk about healing as though it were a road you begin and eventually complete. As though there is a moment somewhere ahead where you will look up and know with certainty that you have arrived. The reality is gentler and stranger and in many ways more interesting than that. Coming back to yourself happens in fragments. In small moments of recognition. In the day you express an opinion without immediately softening it and notice that the room does not collapse. In the morning, you wake up and lie there for a few moments simply existing, without immediately calibrating the emotional temperature of someone else's sleep. Many who work through the aftermath of emotionally costly relationships describe a period that is disorienting in its ordinariness. The relationship is over, or the awareness of what it cost has finally landed, and you expected something more. Some kind of transformation, some unmistakable before and after. Instead, there is just Tuesday. Just the unremarkable texture of a day that is entirely your own, and the peculiar anxiety of having no one to manage. Number weather to monitor, no emotional landscape to tend. The freedom feels, at first, almost like abandonment. Not because you miss the relationship, you are often very clear that you do not. But because the organizing structure of your days was built around someone else's needs. And without those needs to structure around, you are confronted with a question that is both simple and enormous. What do I need? This is the question that the wrong relationship made almost impossible to ask honestly. Not because it was explicitly forbidden, it rarely is, in these dynamics, but because the energy required to ask it and then wait long enough to hear an honest answer was always consumed before you could get there. The practice of coming back to yourself, then, is in large part the practice of learning to ask that question again, and to wait for the answer without immediately discarding it as too much, too needy, too inconvenient. It is important to say clearly that this beginning is not linear. There are days of real clarity, days when you feel the shape of yourself distinctly, when the old aliveness returns in flashes, and you remember with some relief that it was not destroyed, only buried. And then there are days when the old patterns reassert themselves with remarkable ease, when the habit of smallness is so automatic you are halfway into it before you notice. This is not failure. This is the nature of patterns that were formed over years of repetition. They do not dissolve because you have decided they should, loosen slowly through the patient work of noticing, of choosing differently, of allowing yourself to take up space even when every old nerve ending insists it is not safe to do so. The women who move through this most fully tend to share a quality that has nothing to do with strength in the way that word is usually used. Not the absence of pain, not the ability to move fast, not the refusal to look back. They share a quality more like willingness, a willingness to be honest about what the relationship cost without the softening that comes from still protecting the person who caused it. A willingness to feel what the body has been holding without immediately reaching for a story that makes it more bearable. A willingness to sit with the not yet, knowing, the period of being between a self that was shaped by that relationship and a self that is being, slowly, reclaimed. There is also, and this perhaps is the most tender thing to say, a willingness to grieve what was genuinely good. Because it was not all bad. If it had been all bad, it would not have cost so much. The good things, the real ones, the moments of genuine connection, the person you believed he could be, the version of the future you were building inside your imagination, those deserve to be mourned honestly, not dismissed as naivety. You are not foolish to hope. You were human. And what you are doing now, this slow, honest reckoning, is also human, and it is brave in the quietest and most meaningful way. Before we reach our final chapter together, I want to share something. Unchained Heart has many audiobooks that live in this same healing universe, explorations of the highly sensitive person, the inner child, the patterns we carry from childhood into the relationships we choose as adults. This one has reached you in the way that I hoped it would. There is more waiting for you. Please subscribe to Unchained Heart if you have not already, and turn on notifications so that each new audiobook finds you when it is ready. You deserve a library of this. A whole library of being understood. Let us now sit with what it feels like when the cost begins to lift. Chapter 6. What life feels like when the heart begins to free itself. There is a particular quality of light that comes through a window when you have finally stopped being afraid of the room. You do not notice it arriving. You simply find, one ordinary morning, that the light is different, not the light itself, which has not changed, but your relationship to it. Your capacity to receive it. Something in you that had been braced and contracted and turned inward, toward the management of something difficult, is now, for the first time in perhaps years, turned outward, toward the warmth of the window, toward the simple fact of a morning that belongs entirely to you. This is how it tends to begin, not with fireworks, not with a triumphant sense of arrival, with a window, with a cup of tea that you made exactly as you wanted it, without measuring it against anyone's preference but your own, with a conversation in which you expressed something true about yourself and felt, afterward, not the old residue of waiting to see how it landed, but something that resembled, at first almost unrecognizably, ease. The heart that is freeing itself does not announce itself dramatically. It announces itself in small moments of reclamation. The appetite returning, not just for food, but for experience, for beauty, for the company of people who make you feel expanded rather than reduced. The opinions that begin, tentatively, to surface again without the old anxious reflexive editing. The preferences, small, daily, specific, that you begin to follow without justifying their existence. The way your body slowly begins to unbrace, to release the held breath of years, to remember what it feels like to walk into a room without first assessing it for threats. There is a woman who, in the first spring after leaving, planted tomatoes. She had always loved gardens, but had let this love quiet itself over the years, the way she had let so many things quiet. She planted them with no particular intention beyond the pleasure of the act, and she found, as she worked in the soil, that she was not thinking about anyone else. Not managing anything, not monitoring the quality of the air around her. She was simply there, in her own company, doing something she wanted to do. She cried a little, later, and did not entirely understand why. Perhaps because the forgetting of something like that, the forgetting that you are allowed to simply be in the world on your own terms, takes time to grieve even in its undoing. The heart that is beginning to free itself develops a new relationship to time. There is less of the frantic quality that characterized the years of management, less of the relentless present-tense urgency that comes from living inside someone else's emotional volatility. Time becomes something you can actually inhabit rather than simply survive. You begin to make plans that are yours and feel the quiet pleasure of looking forward to something. You begin to know your own rhythms again when you need solitude, when you need company, when your body wants to move and when it wants stillness, and to honor those rhythms without first asking permission from the needs of someone else. Something else happens too, that is harder to describe but no less real. A kind of clarity arrives about what love should feel like. Not a bitterness. This is important, because bitterness would be understandable and earned and is still not quite this, but a clarity. A quiet, grounded knowing of the difference between a love that asks you to expand and a love that requires you to contract. Between a relationship that is genuinely mutual and one that is organized, however subtly, around the primacy of one person's needs over the other's. You carry this knowing differently than you carry pain. It is lighter. It is orienting rather than destabilizing. It is, in the truest sense, something you have earned. The invisible cost of loving the wrong person was real. It was paid in pieces of yourself that you may have believed in the darkest hours were simply gone. They were not gone. They were waiting. They were the woman who planted tomatoes. The woman who woke up early and belonged to herself again. The woman who found, against all her own prior certainty, that there was still something left to come back to. There was always something left to come back to. Conclusion throughout these chapters: we have sat with the invisible cost of loving the wrong person, the gradual erosion of a self that happened not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small surrenders. We have sat with the way it begins, softly and ambiguously, as need that looks like love. We have sat with what it does to identity over time, how the woman who entered becomes smaller, quieter, more interior, until the question of what she wants produces only silence. We have sat with the exhaustion that has no name, the labor without reciprocity, the chronic readiness of a body that learned it could not afford to fully relax. We have sat with what the body holds, the archive of everything the mind was still arguing about. We have sat with the beginning of return, fragmented, non-linear, brave in the quietest possible way. And we have sat, finally, with what it begins to feel like when the cost starts to lift, when the light through the window looks different, when time becomes habitable again. What does this mean for where you are right now? Perhaps you are still inside. Perhaps you are on the threshold, somewhere in the uncertain middle of knowing and not quite being ready to act on what you know. Perhaps you left long ago and are still in the slow work of reclaiming what was quietly given away. All of these places are valid. All of them deserve the same thing: honesty without cruelty, and a witness who does not flinch. If there is one thing I would want you to hold from this audiobook, it is this: the cost was real, and it mattered. And it is not a reflection of your worth that you paid it. You paid it because you were capable of love in a situation that was not designed to honor that capacity. You paid it because your empathy, your attunement, your willingness to stay and try and understand, all of these are genuine things, good things, that were simply inside the wrong container. The invisible cost of loving the wrong person is made visible in the naming of it. And there is something that shifts, quietly and permanently, when what has been unnamed is finally spoken. When the grief that had no funeral is finally acknowledged. When the woman who became smaller is seen, truly seen, in the fullness of what she survived and the extraordinary, ordinary courage of her slow return. You are returning. Even now, in this quiet moment, you are returning. You have carried this long enough, and you are not carrying it alone anymore. If this audiobook has been a companion to you today, please follow Unchained Heart. Press that button wherever you are listening, and let this be a place you return to whenever the work of coming back to yourself needs company. You deserve that company.